My name's Justin McLuhan. I'm here today with
Will Sloan.
And you're listening to the Important Cinema Club. And today, we're getting in the gutter with the, I guess, ultimate gutter auteur, Andy Milligan.
I think it's fair to say that when we use that expression, gutter auteur, this is who we're talking about.
Yes.
This is the definitive one.
I mean, people could also apply to somebody like Ed Wood as well.
Sure. I think we've used it to talk about Sean Costello in recent months. But Andy Milligan is the man for you if you think Ed Wood is just a little too mainstream.
Yeah. If you want something a little bit more confrontational, something that's in your face, and a pure individual expression of one very conflicted soul.
Last week I mentioned this quote that John Waters said about Andy Milligan. He said that his career poses the question, can a genius be untalented?
I would disagree with that statement.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I think Andy Milligan is talented in the very specific thing that he does.
Well, he's unique. He's an individual. He has no command of the rules of film grammar.
Or he does, and he's just not interested in them. Like, he sees things very much like this is how they're supposed to be done. And he approaches in a very repetitive, normalized way that I'm not going to change any of the way that I put these things together.
His films, which include such titles as The Man with Two Heads, The Rats Are Coming, The Werewolves Are Here. The Body Beneath,
The Bloodthirsty Butchers, Torture Dungeon,
Surgikill.
But I would say every title that we've mentioned are some of his lesser films, the ones that didn't actually interest him that much, but he made because he knew he could have a meager return on them.
Probably his best movies include Fleshpot on 42nd Street,
or The Nightbirds,
The Seeds,
yeah, or Vapors.
I would not hesitate to call Andy Milligan one of my favorite directors.
Really?
I mean, he's somebody who I'm deeply fascinated by. That said, even the best Andy Milligan movies flirt with being unwatchable.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The worst of them are unwatchable.
I mean, the worst Andy Milligan films are talky and boring, and you just can't wait until they're over.
And the best Andy Milligan films, they're talky and boring.
But they're also intense.
Oh, yeah.
It's like people screaming at each other. The emotions start at like 11 and just move to 12 somehow.
They're actively unpleasant to watch. They're full of shouting and violence, insanely wordy, disorienting camera work, and with subject matter that is hideous. Incest, rape, just evil people.
And the thing about Milligan is that he also represents like the ultimate dream of people that think about, oh, if I could just go on to 42nd Street, what kind of movies would they be playing? Because they'd be playing these Andy Milligan horror films. I mean, Stephen King in his book Dance Macabre, his collection of essays on movies and horror fiction, talks about one of Milligan's movies, and he's like, oh, a moron made this.
Yeah. Well, I've always been fascinated by Milligan's movies, just imagining them playing on 42nd Street. Like, because these movies are, in some ways, as rock bottom as you've ever had be like theatrically released.
Almost all of his films were made for under $10,000, which is absurd when you consider that he also shot them on film because that was the only format available to him.
Often on short ends.
Yes.
Often with a 16mm sound on film camera.
Yeah, newsreel camera.
Held himself. And you watch some of them. And by the way, considering the impoverished conditions they were made, would you believe that many of his movies are elaborate period pieces?
With crazy costumes, because one of those slices of Milligan's life that is almost too absurd to be real is that he was a dressmaker, and before he got into movies, he actually owned a dress shop.
So I said I was fascinated by the fact that these movies actually played in theaters, because I sometimes wonder, like, did the Grindhouse audience, how do they stand for this?
Did they, rebel?
How do they stand for some of this stuff? I know that Michael J. Weldon, in his Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film, which was written in the 80s when Milligan was still alive, one of the reviews, he just says, if you're an Andy Milligan fan, there's no hope for you.
Well, because you go into these films that have these lurid posters and ad copy, it's like Torture Dungeon. Like, you'll see stuff that has never been put onto the screen. And then you go, and it's essentially like prop dummy hands and just paint blood splattered all over the place. So you can understand, like, the genre-hungry horror fan seeing these and being like, what the hell?
I think what I find most fascinating about his movies... Okay, there's so many things I find fascinating about his movies, including the fact that they're the product of a deranged vision. But they are like real howls from the gutter. They are from the gutter, about the gutter, for the gutter, and they're by a man who, like you watch these movies, and some of them have certain superficial comparisons with, say, the films of John Waters, but John Waters comes across as so much more of a careerist next to Andy Milligan.
Andy Milligan wants to burn every bridge as he walks over it.
Like, Andy Milligan is this, like, walking open wound of a person who's just spilling these... he apparently had a very hard life, and he's spilling all this trauma onto the screen, and there's something compelling about that.
Do you think you would find it compelling if you came to his work and did not know about his life? Like if you stumbled upon one of his movies, for example, Bloodthirsty Butchers.
Well, I'm actually glad you asked, because Bloodthirsty Butchers was the first of his movies I ever saw, and I was compelled by it.
Oh, wow.
I found it hard to watch, and as I was watching it again today, I still found it hard to watch. I mean, basically, it just sort of tickled me the first time I saw it, because it's his version of the Sweeny Todd story, and it's just so cheap. It's cheap beyond comprehension. So I was quite delighted by that, and I wanted to know more about him.
And what's amazing about the movie is that you assume that it's like people in Staten Island doing accents, but he was in Britain during that time.
Yeah.
So it's like his aesthetic is so pure that even when he has the real stuff, you assume that he's faking it on screen.
Andy Milligan does have a fascinating life, though. It was documented in an essential biography by Jimmy McDonough called The Ghastly One. He was born in Minnesota in 1929, had an unhappy childhood. You'll often see in his movies the archetype of the domineering matriarch, and it seems that Andy himself had a difficult relationship with his own mother.
Seems. That's all he ever talked about.
It is possible that he was abused sexually by his mother. We don't know that for sure.
I mean, that's extended to his dislike and hate of essentially all women that he knew in his life, but at the same time, he also hated everybody in his life.
Yeah, he seems to have been a hard guy to get along with.
Yeah,
also, seems.
Yeah, seems.
He served in the Navy for 4 years as a young adult. I think that's where he really came into his sexuality.
Yes, because Andy Milligan was openly gay, but a very specific kind of gayness in that he had no interest in anyone that wasn't like masculine and dominating as a man. Everybody else he thought was weak.
So he didn't like that kind of limp-wristed stereotype.
Even though that character of the drag queen appears a lot in his movies. So, and there seems to be some affinity there, even though that people in his life were like, oh no, yeah, he hates that stuff.
He moved to New York City in 1951 as a young man, and as you mentioned, he did open a dress shop there. One of the important elements of his early life was beginning in 1960, he worked at an off Broadway theater called the Cafe Chino, which is sort of a semi-legendary stage venue.
Oh man, reading about it in Jimmy McDonough's book is just hellish.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to have been this like theater of cruelty.
Yes, I mean, Andy Milligan's entire art is also filtered through this like sadomasochistic outlook on life that he had as well, which he was very open about. The
Cafe Chino, I guess it was Andy Warhol adjacent.
Oh yeah, but Andy Milligan hated Andy Warhol.
Right.
He thought the idea of like 15 minutes, superstars, trash. Andy Milligan was one of those guys who's like, I have no time for people that want to be famous or who want to be intellectual. Also, if you're trying to just squeak by through life and do drugs and drinking, I hate that as well. Basically, if you're not me, you suck.
Well, all of Andy Warhol's art is, including his films, are kind of cold and distant, whereas Milligan,
hot,
down and dirty.
Yep.
And apparently he was a playwright, and he wrote a number of his own plays for Cafe Chino, but he also did a number of Jean Genet plays, and apparently he did some rather radical reinterpretations of them. He was, I guess you could say that he was an abusive director.
Yeah, he was. I mean,
he would hurt his actors.
And the actors would also hurt themselves, like physically punching themselves on stage.
The New York police would notoriously like come over to the Cafe Chino because they would hear just blood-curdling screams and there'd be reports of violence. But no, that's the play.
Yeah, that's right.
Where does the play end and where does the abuse begin?
And after plowing his way through this theater, he worked at another theater that supposedly when they tried to shut him out, he ripped up all the seats with a knife.
What a guy.
Yep.
His film career began in the mid-60s. His first film from 1965 is called Vapors. It's a 32-minute avant-garde film about gay life in New York 4 years before Stonewall.
And a gay life that Milligan himself said he had no interest in. It was actually written by somebody else.
And this movie, you know, it has some of the technical imperfections of the rest of his movies, but if you watch it, it suggests a whole different career that he could have had.
A softer touch.
Yeah, it's sort of a sweet movie. It's set at a bathhouse, the famous St. Mark's bathhouse, and it is about this young man who goes to the bathhouse and he befriends this older man who's stuck in a loveless marriage, and they spend an evening just talking to each other in their stall. And then, of course, later it ends with this young man being humiliated. All the surviving versions are censored, but it ends with a guy walking into the young man's bathhouse stall with his big cock.
Andy Milligan said it was the only reason that he wanted to make the movie. But, it's essentially Milligan's in the mood for love. An unconsummated relationship on screen.
It's an interesting short. It's genuinely atmospheric. I think the bathhouse depicted in grainy black and white, I think this might have been shot on 8mm. It looks actually kind of otherworldly, probably accidentally. But there is something about it that captures the atmosphere of, what I imagine was the covert nature of bathhouse living.
So this movie, Vapors, it played to kind of two audiences, because it somehow crossed the line and played in a few art house theaters, but it also made its way to the sexploitation circuit.
It was marketed as, and I quote, a major homosexual film comparable to Kenneth Anger's Fireworks, which, again, imagine, maybe there's an alternate universe where Andy Milligan became the next Kenneth Anger.
No, but instead, Andy Milligan met William Mishkin, and they set off on a journey of co-exploitation.
Now, who was William Mishkin?
He was a film distributor, and he was known in the 42nd Street film world as kind of like the lowest of the low. David F. Friedman said that Mishkin would get all the European hairy armpit movies, is what he called them.
This relationship between Milligan and Mishkin, Milligan made many movies for Mishkin, most of which are now lost.
Yeah, 8 out of 11 of them are just gone.
Yeah.
Mostly because Mishkin's son just threw them all out in 2001 because he's like, they're taking up room. What are we going to do with them? They're never going to make any money.
Heartbreaking.
Yep. And Andy Milligan himself lost 2 of them because he saw no real value in re-releasing them or anything like that.
Most of the Andy Milligan movies we have now, we have because of the conservation efforts of Nicholas Winding Refn.
That's right. And Something Weird, who found a lot of the negatives before they were about to be thrown out. I mean, I wish we had all these early movies because the sexploitation films feel like they're closer to what Andy Milligan wanted to make, which were really heightened dramas, or melodramas to be more specific. While the horror stuff that he did later on was not on his wavelengths, and he did not like making those movies.
Yeah, well, we have one of his early sexploitation movies from Mishkin, from 1968. It's called Seeds, and this, until recently, was only available in a heavily butchered version called Seeds of Sin.
Which inserted, whole, porn scenes into the plot.
Just lengthy softcore couplings with other actors, but just close-ups of the bodies.
But thank God I think Vinegar Syndrome are the people that restored it.
Vinegar Syndrome did a very impressive restoration of it, and it's apparently one of their lowest-selling Blu-rays.
What? If you're listening to this and you have any interest in Andy Milligan, you get out there and you buy Seeds.
Because Seeds, oh my God, I mean, this movie, it is close to unwatchable, but it's also
I love it so
it's also
much.
a masterpiece.
I have to say that not only is it as claustrophobic as most Andy Milligan's films, because when you think of him as a visual stylist, it's the camera's always tight on people. Sometimes when it's 2 people talking, the camera will be crooked so he can get both of them in frame.
Yeah, imagine a movie like John Waters' Female Trouble, but with the style cranked up maybe twice as much, and with no irony.
And Seeds has the advantage of also being shot in pristine black and white. So it just pops off the screen in a different way than his color pictures do. And I think black and white works better for Milligan because there is that intensity there.
Yeah, and it's shot at Milligan's Staten Island Victorian mansion.
Hollywood Center or something like that.
Yeah, he owned, Milligan was not a wealthy man, but he did own own this mansion, and it looks awful. I mean, it's just a hideous, like, clashing wallpaper.
Dilapidated, just and they shot it. I guess they must have shot it like in the fall or the spring because all the trees have like no leaves on them. It just looks awful. The movie takes place during Christmas as well, so make it a Christmas movie. And like most of Milligan's pictures, it's about like a family coming together and just hating on each other.
Yeah, it takes place over a weekend reunion, which is ruled by, yes, a domineering matriarch who is like if Norman Bates's mother actually was alive, but was still the skeleton.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, she's wheelchair bound, she's alcoholic, and she's constantly yelling at all her family, "You're bad seeds, you're nothing but bad seeds."
You look at a movie like this and you wonder, in a different climate, could have Milligan have gotten that like John Cassavetes, like, just like cinema verite cred behind him?
Yeah.
Because like this, like some of John Cassavetes' self-produced films, has that kind of like you're in the moment as it's happening. Stuff is kind of out of focus. The camera just catching things out of the corner of the lens.
Yeah, it's like you know, Husbands and Wives, that visual style.
Well, Milligan, he used to love to do the camera move, swirl the camera, where he would end a scene with like kind of like spinning in the air, like pointing to the ground, because the movies were so cheap. He could not pay for any opticals. The only thing he could do for transitions were fades done in camera. So if he wanted to get out of a scene, the way that he would do it is he just, like I said, just spin around the camera, which gives it also an insane intensity you see in no other movie.
Oh god, it feels like being trapped in the brain of a madman. It's got a full cast of characters, including you know, brothers and sisters who've had incestuous relationships. That's right, plural. There's a young, troubled teenage boy who's been kicked out of the service for being gay, and the priest uncle who abused him. There is talk of botched abortions. I'm just the tip of the iceberg.
The kitchen sink is thrown
so
in.
many unpleasant things. Oh, and by the way, there's a serial killer loose. He's killing them all one by one.
But I think that because it doesn't have that, I guess, tawdry feel of his later color horror films, that serial killer part works differently than it does.
And yeah, the later color horror films like Bloodthirsty Butcher, like they have lulls.
Yeah, you feel that when he was making something like Seeds, he was putting his all into it. Like, this is Milligan, like, uncut. While later on, he's made a lot of movies. He essentially has a pretty good idea of how much money he's going to make. Almost nothing. So why try that hard? Like, he doesn't need to put all his passion in it like you get in Seeds.
I do have a fondness for Bloodthirsty Butchers, though. I think you probably had a hard time with it this week, right?
I mean, it's so boring.
It is boring, but just the idea of Andy Milligan making a Sweeny Todd movie on $10,000.
You know who's a big Andy Milligan fan? Matt Farley.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Well, Matt Farley, of course, would like Andy Milligan because Milligan's movies are all about the boring, talky parts.
Yeah, exactly.
The violence.
He is probably the only fan, along with Tom Scalzo and Charles Roxburgh, his two pals who do shock marathons, of The Rats Are Coming, The Werewolves Are Here, because they just like, they love those like weird kind of character quirks in just a sea of nothing happening.
Yeah, so the first time I saw Bloodthirsty Butchers, I thought it was one of the movies he made in Staten Island. Even though it actually was shot in Britain with British actors. And some of that is just because like the people that he got to be in his movies, some of them were trained actors, most of them weren't. Some of them were just people that he picked up at the butcher shop, or boyfriends that he had, or this or that. And they're all just strange,
just
looking
weird
and
looking
acting people, and seeing them wandering around speaking in these British accents. Or Nicholas Winding Refn just discovered and released an unfinished Southern Gothic that Milligan made called The House of Seven Bells.
His Gone with the Wind.
or his The Beguiled.
Yeah.
And this one was shot in Staten Island, and it's full of all of Milligan's actors, you know, dressed in their Reconstruction era best, going, "I do declare." And it's so funny.
I love all of the costumes in the Milligan film. Like, all of his horror films are period pieces. It seems like the only way he could get through them is by applying another artistic passion that he had, like making dresses and costumes, and that's how he could get through them. But it also creates this hilarious contradiction where it's like a bunch of people from Staten Island walking around Milligan's mansion that just looks awful, wearing these kind of like weathered and terrible dresses that have seen much better days.
There's a great scene in House of Seven Bells where it's like a sewing circle of just Southern belles, and they're just in this like empty room in, I guess, Milligan's house, this big hallway, and it just looks like any house from the 1970s. But you've got all these women dressed in their Southern finery, and it's otherworldly. I use that word too much on this podcast, but it really
it's
is.
Your go-to.
It's just such a strange image.
Now, Fleshpot on 42nd Street, which is last Milligan film that we both watched, I think what's interesting about it is that it's probably his best film, and for a long time, it was lost in a complete version. Again, I think Vinegar Syndrome saved it and released it.
Yeah, I saw an incomplete one that
Something Weird put out
many years ago, which was also just very hard to watch.
Yeah, very dark, too. Yeah, I mean, Milligan's films are famous for the optical soundtracks being almost unlistenable. So, like, the Vinegar Syndrome release is as good as it's going to look and sound. And it's actually pretty good. And at this point, I believe that Milligan is still working for Mishkin.
Yeah, this one's 1973.
So just to do like a real fast forward through his career, after making those sexploitation films, Milligan started making horror pictures, and then he went to London. And then he had a contract with a producer to make Nightbirds, and then that contract kind of exploded during their second picture, The Body Beneath. And then he went back to Mishkin, and Mishkin funded more films in London before he finally ended up back again in New York, Staten Island, and he continued to make films for Mishkin, who continued to pay him almost nothing for his stuff.
And it's not like Milligan had anywhere else to go.
No, he did.
Because no other distributor would employ this man.
Well, like David F. Friedman in the Jimmy McDonough book talks about how he had no idea how Mishkin booked such sweet dates at theaters. Like, there was one theater that everybody wanted to play, and somehow Mishkin was able to book, like, all of Milligan's pictures there. And at the end of the day, a lot of them made money because Mishkin was a real canny salesman. He could sell that sizzle, even though there was no stake.
They had good titles, they had good posters. Bloodthirsty Butchers.
Yeah, Torture Dungeon.
What do you want? Yeah.
And then something like Fleshpot on 42nd Street, Mishkin actually forced Andy Milligan to shoot some hardcore that they put into the movie.
I mean, this is the one that really feels like it emerged from the gutter, to the point where it opens with this shot of 42nd Street, a camera traveling along the Deuce.
An anomaly for a Milligan film, the kind of guerrilla-style shooting.
And it actually feels, because the camera is crooked and it's sort of at knee level, and it really feels like the camera is somehow like rising up from the muck and the filth and the cum.
Go home, camera, you're drunk.
Yeah. And eventually the camera finds Laura Cannon, who stars as the titular Fleshpot. She's a prostitute and just all-around survivor in Times Square.
Laura Cannon, an actual porn actor, I think probably most famous from everyone's favorite Sean Costello film, Forced Entry.
That's right, and she also reunites with the star of that film, Harry Reams.
Very charming in this movie.
Later in this one, yeah. Laura Cannon, as we join her, she's fleeing from her current loveless relationship, a purely transactional relationship. She steals some stuff from his apartment and gets out, and her only friend in the world is this drag queen played by Neil Flanagan, who gives actually rather a touching performance.
I think all three of the main players give fairly touching performances. Even somebody like Laura Cannon, who in this movie, it's almost like her life documented. There's a Rialto Report podcast episode where they kind of like hunted down like what she's been doing since that time. And essentially her character was not as destitute as she is in this movie, but it was a variation of that. Like, she could have been a Broadway actor and she just never made it. So she kind of struggled throughout her life.
So the Laura Cannon character is a street fighter, a survivor, and one day she just happens upon this really nice finance guy played by Harry Reams. who falls in love with her, sees the good in her, takes her to his home in Staten Island, and it seems this might be her Prince Charming, you know?
Before we get to the shocking end that Milligan cannot help but insert in the last 2 minutes of the movie, I should point out that this is one of Milligan's most empathetic movies as well. There's a lot of scenes with the characters just hanging out at the bar, just chit-chatting. There's that kind of angry kind of dialogue jumping between a lot of the women, but there's also kind of, I don't know, a softer touch than he usually shows. While every character shows themselves as well to be like backstabbing and evil, you also get a sense of friendship between them, that they're all struggling and they're trying to figure out a way to get out of the situation.
And you sense that the movie doesn't hate these characters like it normally does.
Yeah, because even at the end when, you can see the movie, but essentially turns as bad as it could for the character, almost as if Milligan, like, making the movie is like, well, I can't just have a happy ending.
Yeah.
This is crazy. So we have to have this out-of-nowhere thing to happen, and then essentially the worst final shot you could have.
But yeah, as you say, the three central players, they're all quite charming. I think Flanagan gives the best performance, but the other two, there's something sort of authentic about them. And there's a scene where Harry Reams takes Laura Cannon in a taxi, down to the South Ferry, and they're clearly in a real taxi, and Milligan just like shoves the camera in the back seat with them, and so they're backlit horribly, and the shot is crooked. And yeah, there's something kind of documentary-like, and the fact that it actually stars these two real porn stars makes it feel like, because so the relationship between them, it's a lot to swallow. It's very contrived, but the fact that it's shot in this way with these people under these circumstances, you could see that there's something real in this story of squalid people searching for redemption.
Well, I would say that like that immediacy and Milligan's patented style is already like head and shoulders over most porn directors even trying to do this kind of sexploitation thing. Like, he was working with the budgets and technical equipment that most pornos utilize, if not less so. And I think that as a storyteller, he's head and shoulders above most of them that are considered like the great porn directors, other than like Radley Metzger and stuff like that.
Sure.
Who are on a completely different level.
Well, his scripts are certainly more loquacious than most porn directors. I mean,
very Matt Farley-ish again.
Yeah, just long. I mean, he is a theater director to his core. Eventually, his work with Mishkin dried up. I did dip into one of the movies he made later in life.
Monstrosity.
That's right.
Good luck.
Yeah. He made 3 movies, or actually 4 movies in the 80s, including The Weirdo and Surgikill, which was his last one. Monstrosity he shot in LA, and he has certain kind of like punk aesthetics in it. It's a Frankenstein story.
And he's trying to make like a goofy horror comedy, which is like kind of out of his wheelhouse, and you don't feel he's very comfortable with it. It's like, I just want to make something that'll sell some tickets, please.
Yeah, he's not good when he's actually trying to be funny.
No, he's not.
And also, it's just competent enough. Like, he has a bit of a crew making Monstrosity.
That's right, because that's the one that Jimmy McDonough worked on, right?
That's right. I listened to a bit of the Jimmy McDonough commentary on it, and McDonough said, well, this was kind of a bittersweet day because Andy Milligan actually hired a special effects artist to do these gore effects. Normally, it used to just be him. It's like, yeah, when you get more competent technicians working on your film, basically you've just got a bad film.
So you think that if it was just mannequin hands, there'd be more charm there.
Yeah, and again, he's trying to be funny.
And like, he didn't like shooting on 35mm either. He didn't like the aesthetic of it. He did it like once before as well. He liked his 16mm optical sound sync camera. That's like 1 second off. Yeah. And when you take that away, I think that the thing that kind of endears us to him is gone.
Surgikill, which was his last movie, and it's kind of a Police Academy style comedy set in a hospital. I've seen 10 minutes of it. It will kill you.
I mean, Andy Milligan, the end of his life is not a pleasant time.
Yeah, he died of AIDS in abject poverty. His remains were buried in an unmarked grave because he was too poor. Jimmy McDonough, the biographer, was one of, I think, only 2 people who knew of his diagnosis and became basically his caretaker in the last year of his life.
I mean, if it wasn't for Jimmy McDonough, like, Nicholas Winding Refn probably wouldn't have gotten the negatives and all the materials that allowed this kind of resurgence of his work, because Andy Milligan has been suddenly like rediscovered. Companies like Code Red are putting most of his horror films out. Garage House Pictures is putting out insane special editions of his later period films like Monstrosity and The Weirdo. And Nicholas Winding Refn, again, is doing remasters that he's putting for free online at buynwr.com.
I think for anybody curious about Andy Milligan, go to Vinegar Syndrome and get their Blu-ray of Fleshpot on 42nd Street. Maybe also get their Blu-ray of Seeds.
Yeah, throw Seeds in there as well.
And if you don't like them, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yes.
Because these are real minority tastes.
We have not undersold these movies. I think we've been very honest in their reality.
Yeah. Even these ones, the ones that are the best ones,
yes.
they may take you a little... They're an acquired taste.
But... you know what? Jimmy McDonough's book, which has been out of print forever, is being re-released again by Fab Press. And read that book, and you will become obsessed with the filmmaker. It's impossible not to once you get his whole life story. All right. So, as per usual, you can send us letters at importantcinemaclubpodcast@gmail.com. And our first letter is from Elias Brander, and he goes, "Hi. When was the last time you cried while watching a movie? Is there anything specific in movies that often move you to tears or subjects that tend to affect you very emotionally? I just recently realized that, almost as a rule, always cry when watching Miyazaki films, and I'm not quite sure why."
The one that makes me cry whenever I see it, or that makes me tear up or get a little emotional.
Glenn or Glenda?
Well, Glenn or Glenda, yeah, I definitely get emotional. I'm not moved to tears, though.
Okay.
Probably The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Really?
Yeah, because that's a movie where for the whole first hour...
That's a real, like, dad take. It's like the only movie that makes me cry.
And the other one is Ford versus Ferrari.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
the Dirty Dozen.
Yeah. But no, like, the first hour of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, like, whenever I watch it, I keep thinking, wow, this is really corny. Because it's so full of all those scenes where it's like Jimmy Stewart is like, now listen, the Constitution, it starts with "we the people." You know, it has dialogue like that. But I don't know, there's a cumulative impact to it. I don't know. I'm just going to ramble and not make any sense.
But you just watch it, and it makes you sad, like a tear down your eye.
Well, because the emotions that it evokes are so complex. The fact that the Tom Donovan character, played by John Wayne, becomes outmoded and it necessarily has to cede into the background, but is
as
that a good thing?
As opposed to me, who I'm like, yeah, get John Wayne out of here. It's terrible pulp. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
You know what movie makes me cry every time? The ending of Speed Racer. Tear to my eye.
It's a beautiful
that last
film.
montage at the end where it's all about like art and why you do stuff and like why it's important in somebody's life. Just that is like pure cinema right there.
I got a bit emotional when I watched Nashville again recently, specifically the scene where there's the shooting at the Parthenon at the end and the Henry Gibson character who spent the whole movie playing this big fish in a small pond that, you know, we must be doing something right to last 200 years. That guy who's like the most famous man in Nashville. So he's just a big fish in a small pond. But then he like... after the shooting, he heroically like grabs the mic and is like, now listen, we can't have any of that. Keep singing. This isn't Dallas. This is Nashville. And what's so moving about that scene is he's a pathetic character, but in this one moment, he's been called upon to live up to the ideals he set for himself, and he does it.
Yeah.
And that's very powerful to me. And it actually made me tear up a bit.
It's, you know, I mostly tear up, not usually at, like, stuff... Well, you know, I should be specific. I cry all the time during movies, to the point that my partner Emily is like, "Are you crying at this?" And I'm like, oh, God, it's so sad. No, I just got something in my eye. But it's like, oftentimes, like, a happy cry will, like, get me. Like, something very joyous and climactic about the movie will, like, get me.
Very cathartic.
Yeah, cathartic. Sure. That's what really, like, gets those tear ducts rolling.
The ending of It's a Wonderful Life has got me in the past.
You know what really makes me cry is the ending of Don't Let the River Beast Get You. Just tears of laughter rolling down my cheeks. Have you ever laughed so hard during a movie that you've cried?
Oh, yeah. Borat, when I saw that in the theater.
I think
the naked wrestling scene was
right.
maybe the hardest I've ever laughed.
I'm trying to think, like, Anchorman made me laugh so hard that my friends thought I was, like, dying. And it was the whole crazy, like, fight scene.
Right.
And that didn't make me laugh that much. What made me laugh is it just did cuts to them, like, sitting back, and they're like, you know, that escalated quickly. Like, there was a guy with a net, and I was like, oh, my God. Also... Team America World Police, when he has the beard, and he's like, oh my God.
Yes. That's funny.
I was just laughing. So it's what gets me is like the dumbest thing in the world when it comes to comedies. That will make me laugh and laugh and laugh. All right, so the next question is from a past email writer, Bennett G, and he goes, "Hi guys, it's me again. Since my last email, I had a consultation about getting my tattoo, the one of Woody Allen, removed."
Oh, I remember this. We made a joke on an earlier podcast about regrettable people to get tattoos of and mentioned Woody Allen. And then this gentleman, Bennett, emailed us to mention that he did, in fact, have a Woody Allen tattoo.
And they told him it would cost 800 big ones and 8 months of treatment. Guess I'll be covering it up with a black box. But you'll always know it's under there.
So that is what I'd like to know. How recognizable is it as Woody Allen? Can you say
it's Woody Allen?
Okay, can you say it's Rick Moranis? Just a tip.
It sounds like he probably got the cartoon, like, Woody Allen from, like, the comic strips.
Oh, yeah.
Because that is, like, the tattoo go-to. Isn't that crazy that Woody Allen had, like, a syndicated comic strip? What if he just wrote, like, Rick Moranis underneath? He would know. People would look at it and be like...
That's like Wino forever.
Yeah, I forgot. I think it's on one of his butt cheeks, too, right?
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, you could say that it's like you going against Woody Allen. That's why it's there. Think anybody has any Kevin Smith tattoos? There must be a million.
Oh, I'm sure people have Kevin Smith tattoos. So he's going to cover the tattoo with the black box. Well, another victim of cancel culture.
Oh, gosh. What is this, Michael and Us? Your character's coming out. William, I don't know what your middle name is.
F. Buckley.
Yeah, that's right. So the next question is from Mark Hamilton, and he asks, "Do you believe that there's such a thing as an artistically irredeemable movie? After hearing your valiant efforts to find the positive aspects in the worst wreck from the asylum, or entirely inept shot-on-video efforts, I'm wondering if there are movies that you have seen that are too poorly made and insulting to your intelligence to even attempt to defend. My personal choice for movies that meet that criteria are both unwatchable Blair Witch Project parodies, The Hip-Hop Witch with Eminem and Vanilla Ice, and The Bogus Witch with the Wheeze himself, Pauly Shore. Is there an act of putting images on film or video, even if done with barely any care or thought, enough to justify considering something like The Hip-Hop Witch as an artistic object? Is there an acceptable threshold of badness that a film can fall below where you cannot consider it as art? Thanks, Mark."
Well, I don't think we're just like knee-jerk apologists for everything. I think we did a Pauly Shore episode, and I think there were movies on there where it's like...
all of his movies, we were like, we don't understand Pauly Shore.
But here's the thing, we give every movie their day in court.
That's right, yeah. It's, the old argument of like, isn't everything art? Sure. But is it art that like we think that people should experience? That's a whole different matter.
I will say that there are many movies that I do find irredeemable and just awful and terrible and not worth the effort of defending. But I would also say that movies are constantly changing because movies don't exist in a vacuum. So The Bogus Witch Project starring Pauly Shore, I guarantee is slightly more interesting now, just because we are 20 years removed from the Blair Witch phenomenon, 30 years removed from the Pauly Shore phenomenon, and therefore it's a historic object.
I'm fascinated that this letter writer took offense with 2 Blair Witch parodies. Wait, what about Thumb Witch or whatever, the Blair Thumb Project?
The Steve Odekirk film. I'm not going to defend the Blair Thumb.
But, just like Henri Langlois of the Cinematheque, you can't start deciding what is art or what is not art, because then you have like the Andy Milligan issue, which is most of his films just got tossed out.
I think everything could potentially be redeemed. I mean, not everything's going to be a good movie, but everything is going to be at least slightly interesting if put in the right context.
I'm holding out for that Corky Romano revival.
Corky Romano is endlessly fascinating.
All right, so those are our letters for this week. If you'd like to send us some for next week, it's importantcinemaclubpodcast@gmail.com. So this week on our Patreon, we're talking about all the new movies that have been coming out.
We're talking about big new blockbusters, the first blockbusters of the year. We're going to talk about Bad Boys for Life, and we're also going to talk about Birds of Prey, and the fantabulous emancipation of one Harley Quinn.
Oh, that's right. I'm like, we're talking about a third movie? Oh no, that's just a long title.
That's right. So, we wanted to see what are the big hits.
I'm interested in diving into the research you did in January, where you went to go see almost all of the January release films.
Yeah, let's. So
we're also going to throw that on the fire, and if you want to give that a listen, $5 a month, patreon.com/theimportantcinemaclub. So next week we're getting serious with a bunch of comedians. Yes, that's right. It's been requested that we do comedians again because we did it a long time ago.
We did comedians who failed at movies.
Yes, and while we could do that again, we're deciding to go down a bit of a different path, and we're going to talk about comedians who tried dramatic roles. Tried, I say, like sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. And we'll be talking about Patton Oswalt. He was in Big Fan and in Young Adult.
Yeah.
And we'll also be talking about Richard Pryor.
With his Paul Schrader film Blue Collar. Mm-hmm. And we may talk about another one too.
Yeah, we want to find a more classic Hollywood person, but we just need to figure out who that is first.
I'm trying to sell Justin on Bob Hope in The Seven Little Foys.
You know what? I'll say the same thing you said about somebody else. I don't know what I would have to say about the dramatic artistry of Bob Hope.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm not sure I know either.
All right, so that's what we're doing next week. So until then, I'm Justin Clue.
I'm Will Sloan.
Thanks for listening. Will, it was the biggest night in Hollywood yesterday. It was the grand finale of On Cinema Oscar special.
I haven't watched it yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Gets dark. You didn't hear about that?
Don't spoil it.
All right, I won't spoil it. Do you watch it in its entirety? Yeah. Like all 2.5 hours?
Yeah, absolutely.
You are a madman.
I love every second of it.
So you watched the Oscars suicidally in a public place?
Yeah.
Did you have a fun time?
I did have a fun time.
That's good.
Yeah. With the caveat that the Oscars, I find it increasingly depressing as I get older. Because and
the sparkle falls away from your eyes. Or?
Yeah, like I'm actually getting to a point where I'm starting to find the Oscars kind of like actually unpleasant to watch, and I'll tell you why. I've been trying to figure it out. It's because when you watch the Oscars, this is the film industry saying to you, this is what movies are, and this is the image we want to project of movies. Now, this year's list of winners, I thought, had some good things in it, but good, bad, doesn't matter. It's the Oscars. What matters is just the show in total and the message that the show is delivering you about movies, which are, this is the proper cinema, and this is these are the areas of cinema that we are interested in, and therefore that you should be interested in, which is nothing too old, nothing too off the beaten path. I mean, it's kind of amazing that Parasite...
Well, that's the thing, right? Is that like that's what you take away from this Oscar event, and that's all anybody will be talking about. Another Joker won an Academy Award. Who cares?
Yeah.
As people have said, like it's a Oscar for You Were Never Really Here, which was a better performance, I would say, in the show he won in the Joker.
But like an example of why the Oscars I find it kind of depressing is that montage they did about scenes that had music in them.
Insanity.
Where it's just like, oh, here's a scene from Footloose and Back to the Future and Moulin Rouge. And I counted, and there were 2 clips in that montage from before 1980.
Yep, that's right.
And that's the kind of... And even when they do a montage of, like, actual film history, it's just like, oh, there's Gone with the Wind.
You know what? I think the Oscar producers have taken your note. More montages. Montages suck. I saw a lot of people complaining about that they're like, there were no old clips. I'm like, no montages. Nobody wants to watch this.
Montages do suck, but I don't know. It's just like the Oscars is something that has no interest in film as a medium with a history, and it has no interest in film as
what are you talking about?
World.
Tom Hanks came out to introduce that museum that's going to have like a Jaws statue and stuff like that. It's going to have
some ruby slippers in it.
Yep.
You know, the 5 old movies that people know.
I mean, we talk about this all the time. Like, this podcast exists only to introduce people to stuff that they wouldn't hear about anywhere else.
Yeah.
We get you in with the Tom Cruise, and then we, jump you with the Andy Milligan.
So this is why I like our podcast and why I find the Oscars increasingly an unpleasant place to be. Mm-hmm. It's like watching the Oscars, after doing this podcast for years, like being told by the industry, okay, but this is what film actually is.
What do you say about foreign language film winning Best Picture for the second time after The Artist? Everybody's forgotten about that.
You're right, that was a French film.
It was a French film. It was distributed by the Weinsteins, and they pushed it hard, but it was a foreign language film. Just there wasn't any dialogue in it, so people could just ignore that, I guess.
The intertitles were English.
Oh, were they? Or were those re-edited? It was probably an original French version.
Probably was. Set in Hollywood. Has
yeah, you're right.
Big American stars like John Goodman.
Yeah, and Jean Dujardin.
Yeah.
Wolf of Wall Street, and Lucky Luke himself.
I will say that it was interesting that Parasite won Best Picture. I'm not going to be one of those people who says that Oscar got it right or whatever, because I feel like you can't one year say that the Oscars don't matter and then the next year say the Oscars got it right.
You know, I've seen some arguments about that, which is like, when they get it right, it does matter to people discovering those films. When they get it wrong, it's like, fuck them, it doesn't matter.
I guess that's a fair point.
Yeah.
I guess you want the movies you like to win so that more people will see them. And also, I don't know, it's so stupid to care about the Oscars, and yet every year when I watch it I start caring, and so when a movie like The Irishman gets completely shut out, it's like, fuck, this award show tricked me into caring whether or not The Irishman gets anything.
I was not invested in The Irishman winning any awards. I'm a real legacy kind of guy, that if someone's won awards, give it to somebody new.
Sure, I respect that.
Like Parasite, which won a ridiculous amount of awards, much to the bafflement of its cast and crew.
If we are to play along and say that anything about the Oscars matters, I think it's nice that Parasite won a lot of awards, just because on the game show level, it's fun to see a surprise thing happen.
Yes.
It's like, oh, this adds interest to the ceremony. And also because the Oscars was not set up to honor Korean genre cinema. Mm-hmm. So when something like, you know, there have been 20 years of great, exciting, vibrant Korean cinema, and for that to
lots of films, and
for that to suddenly penetrate the Oscars at the highest level is an interesting development. The idea of a foreign language movie like Parasite, forget about The Artist because it passes as an American movie.
Yeah, it does.
But the idea of a foreign language movie actually winning Best Picture seems to me like something that couldn't have happened 20 years ago, even though Crouching Tiger and Life is Beautiful were nominated. But like they were never actually going to win Best Picture.
No.
And I think the fact that Parasite actually won speaks to so many huge seismic shifts that are happening in the film industry. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, maybe Hollywood has become less culturally chauvinist simply because, like, the legacy studios have crumbled and they're all owned by big international conglomerates, and like there's no legacy film industry in Hollywood to be protective of anymore.
I mean,
right?
Parasite beat like the love letter to 70s Hollywood, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that in any other year would have swept those awards.
But it's like the old Oscars that Billy Crystal used to host and Jack and Warren were in the front row. Like, that seems like kind of an old guard. Like that's back when you had your Warner Brothers and your Universal, and they made movies at Oscar. Like studios don't make Oscar movies anymore.
Well, the thing is, it's all about platforms like Netflix, where I can walk into the living room of my friend and his daughter is watching a Korean soap opera, which would have been unimaginable for like us when we were 12. Yeah. Where would we have seen it?
Yeah, like I could just imagine Parasite coming out 20 years ago and like Billy Crystal making yellow-faced jokes at the Oscar. Like, hey, Parasite's just like Chinese food. I wanted more after I saw it. You know, like that kind of... That's what the Oscars would have been 20 years ago. It would have. But yeah, the world is smaller than it was 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And you pointed out that somebody got real snubbed on the Oscar memoriam.
Oh, yeah. Every year during the Oscar in memoriam montage, I have in my head one or two names that I want to see. And I'm almost always disappointed.
So I'm curious to know how their system works, because when I worked at the Canadian Screen Awards, to get into the in memoriam, you had to apply for that to happen.
Interesting.
So it wasn't just an automatic, like you just picked everybody that died, which could explain why some people were not on the Oscar in memoriam kind of thing.
You think Kirk Douglas's family applied?
Yes.
I think they just put because you can't not have Kirk Douglas in it.
Yeah. I'm not trying to make excuses for them. I'm just saying that that's the system, that the way it goes forward.
We didn't even mention the name.
Larry Cohen.
Larry Cohen was not included in the death montage, and I actually thought he would be.
He's pretty famous so. Like, he was writing big Hollywood scripts.
Yeah,
like...
he wrote movies for Sidney Lumet and Joel Schumacher, you know, in addition to his many own contributions to cinema. Yeah, I was sad to see Larry Cohen not included. Who doesn't love Larry Cohen?
Monsters, that's who.
But we got a few extra shots of Billie Eilish.
That's right.
And I think Larry would understand. But this is exactly the sort of thing that makes me like angry and hate the Oscars, because it's the Oscars to be like, yeah, that's not the real.
Did you have any other names that actually did show up, or was Larry Cohen the one that you were like, where is he?
I guess I was happy to see Terry Jones in there. I wasn't necessarily expecting him to be there.
Yeah, and you wouldn't. Would you have been that angry if Terry Jones wasn't there? It seems like more of an affront to somebody like Larry Cohen or Dick Miller.
Yeah, because Terry Jones wasn't really in the American film industry.
Or Toby Hooper wasn't even included in the In Memoriam.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, so...
Sid Haig was overlooked this year. I'm not shocked by that, but...
Sid Haig wasn't in there?
It would have been nice to have Sid Haig.
Yeah, the Oscars suck. That's what I'm here... That's our final position, right?
Yeah, fuck it.
Yeah. Until next year, when we get Oscar fever again.